Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember to support our channel, please subscribe. The last woman burnt at the stake in England. One of the most brutal methods of execution throughout the centuries used in Britain was burning at the stake. It was used across the world for a number of horrific executions. For example, during the 100 Years' War, Joan of Arc was burned in terrifying scenes. But it remained a common punishment for a number of crimes within England. It's linked to witchcraft and crimes involving religion and heresy. But the final burning in England took place when Catherine Murphy was burnt in the 18th century. In Newgate, outside of the prison in 1789, a huge crowd gathered and the woman accused of counterfeiting was burned. It was considered a harrowing ordeal and was a common punishment for women who were sentenced to death and found guilty of high or petty treason. Hanging, drawing and quartering was the sentence for men, and it was not deemed acceptable for women as it involved nudity. High treason contained a number of serious offences such as counterfeiting money or coining, which involved clipping coins for the small pieces of silver and gold. But also there were many other offences covered by treason. In Britain it isn't known when the first burning took place, but in 1222 a deacon of the church was burned in Oxford. But then, later, in 1401, the king allowed a statute of heresy which gave the clergy and church power to arrest those who were suspected of being heretics or religious criminals. Also, the church could try those, and because of this, there were hundreds of executions linked to religion over the centuries. The first to suffer this new law was William Sauter, a priest who was burnt at King's Lynn in 1402. But when Mary I came onto the throne, she became famously known for burning Protestants at the stake. The daughter of King Henry VIII would burn Protestants, and over 270 of them would be killed in one of the most harrowing ways. Their crimes in most cases were only their religious beliefs, and because of this, many suffered at Smithfield, which became a place where many were burned in London. Observers and eyewitnesses would note how disgusting the scenes were, and often people died a very slow and painful death. There was an account of two bishops, Latimer and Ridley, who were burned during Bloody Mary's reign together, and one of them took a long while to die. Sometimes victims would be placed into an empty tar barrel and then tied to the stake with a fire built around them. But there was also a practice to strangle people before they were burned. But also, some executioners took pity on those who were executed in the way. The executioners sometimes tied gunpowder bags around the necks of the condemned, and as the flames rose, I'm sure you can imagine what happened. The bags would explode, and this was seen as a way of speeding up death. Burning was used by the Spanish Inquisition, who used it, as it did not usually result in the victims shedding their blood, which was against Catholic teachings, and it meant that heretics would also not take anything into their next life, and that burning in the fire would cleanse the soul for those convicted of witchcraft. But inside of England, even after Bloody Mary's reign, many people were burned, with many women being executed in the manner accused of being witches. Witch-finders would hunt women down and then brutally place them on trial. The final woman who was burned as a witch in Scotland was Janet Horne, who was burned in Rochshire in 1727. She was accused of bewitching her daughter, who made her hands and feet grow into horses' hooves, and Janet would then ride her daughter. Unfortunately, her daughter did have a deformed hand, and she was tried and acquitted for this. But later she gave birth to a child who had the same deformity, and for this she was burned. In an act of solidarity, it was Janet Horne's place of burning that the Witchcraft Acts in Scotland were repealed. But in England, one serious crime was met with women being burnt at the stake after they were found guilty of treason. Counterfeiting gold or silver, as mentioned earlier, using coin clippings was very serious, and every woman convicted of this until 1790 was dragged onto a hurdle through a town to a place of execution, where they were then burned with fire until death. It was in this manner that the final burning at the stake in Britain and England took place. Catherine Murphy, on the 18th of March 1789, arrived at her place of execution, Newgate Prison, where she had been held, with a huge crowd gathered. along with her husband Catherine Murphy, had been found guilty of coin clipping, and the scenes at Newgate that day was a bloodbath. A huge mass execution took place outside of the prison, and along with 8 men, including her husband, she was executed. The 8 men were executed by hanging on the gallows and were convicted of a number of offences. As Catherine was a woman, the law at the time stated that instead of being hanged, she should be burned for being sentenced of treason. As Catherine's execution took longer, she was killed after the men and was forced to walk by the hanging corpses on the gallows, which did include her husband's lifeless body. She approached the execution site and was then made to stand on a specially made foot-high 10-square-inch platform in front of a stake. But her execution did not go the usual way of burnings. Catherine was tied to a stake with ropes and an iron ring securing her, and she was then told to say her final words and prayers. Her executioner was well known across London, and William Brunskill then readied the fire and lit the fire underneath Catherine Murphy. As the flames rose, Brunskill then, instead of watching her burn, strangled her to death, and rather than Murphy succumb to the flames, it was this that killed her. One rope was placed around her neck and secured, and she was then choked to death by the executioner, who lifted her off the scaffold. It was then 30 minutes before the fire was lit, or so it was said, and with this it's believed that despite being the last person sentenced to be burned alive, that Catherine Murphy never actually received this sentence. She was dead before she was then burned, which would have still been distressing for the crowd to witness, but it meant that her sentence was not technically carried out. With this there is some debate as to who the actual last woman to be burned at the stake was, some suggesting that it was actually Margaret Sullivan, a woman burned for coining at Newgate a year earlier. But burning at the stake was outlawed in 1790, and it was very unpopular with the local residents who lived near the site of execution. It was a very gruesome and revolting thing for people to witness, and those who lived nearby had to deal with the horrendous smell of someone burning alive. Following this, women who were sentenced to death were usually hanged, and some were even transported for their crimes, being sent to places such as Australia. But burning alive was a sentence of death made famous during the Tudor period by Bloody Mary, but it was used for centuries after. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.